Hello, I'm Amanda Walker and you're watching IMF Today on day 2 of the annual meetings here in Washington, D.C. Here are the big moments of the day.
In short, the worst is yet to come, and for many people, 2023 will feel like a recession.
Global financial stability risks have increased with a balance of risk that is skewed to the downside. Amid highest inflation in decades and extraordinary uncertainty, markets have been extremely volatile.
Governments who have extremely short horizons and mostly worried about staying in power, they want this not to be there on their plate. They don't want to have to deal with a messy default or messy restructuring while it's on their plate. They would rather kick the can down the road.
Debt relief is vital, but debt relief is not a substitute for resources.
Hello and welcome to IMF Today. I'm Amanda Walker. Today was the big one, the headline everyone's been waiting for, the World Economic Outlook.
The global economy is weakening further and facing a historically fragile environment. The outlook continues to be shaped by three forces: persistent and broadening inflation causing a cost of living crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the associated energy crisis, and the economic slowdown in China. For this year, our projection for world GDP growth is unchanged at 3.2% as in the July World Economic Outlook update. Global growth is forecast to slow down to 2.7% in 2023, 0.2 percentage point lower than projected in July. We are concerned that central banks will ease too early, causing inflation to remain excessively high and requiring a much larger loss of output later. The war could further destabilize energy markets. A resurgence of the pandemic would hit under-vaccinated regions hard, especially Africa. Monetary policy should focus on inflation while allowing the exchange rate to adjust to underlying economic forces.
And after that big headline came another, the Global Financial Stability Report. And I spoke with Tobias Adrian, Director of the IMF's Monetary and Capital Markets Department, just after it was released. You talked about storm clouds looming over the global economy. What are the biggest risks?
So our baseline forecast is one where there's already a third of countries in recession. And relative to the baseline, there are many downside risks at the current horizon. Those are the storm clouds. So we're going into an economy that is going to slow down, where inflation is coming down, and where financial conditions are getting tighter and tighter. That means that risky asset prices are dropping. There's the risk that this adjustment in asset prices is going to be disorderly at some point. It's not necessarily the case, it's not our baseline, but there's a heightened risk on that.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it? Inflation, interest rates, the tightening. How complex is it to get this right?
It is a balancing act, absolutely. And it is a difficult one to get right. On the one hand, we need to get inflation under control, so we need to tighten monetary policy, we need to tighten financial conditions, asset prices need to decline, but of course you don't want that to be disorderly. So you want to get the balance right in between tightening and slowing down the economic activity without triggering a crisis.
And how do you do that, and how do you ensure that as many countries do that as possible?
Well, this is where the IMF comes in. So market surveillance and surveillance of economies around the world is very crucial at this point. So what we're doing in our Global Financial Stability Report, in the World Economic Outlook, and in all the bilateral products, so the Article 4s, the financial sector assessment programs, these are very crucial at this time in particular.
And how can people expect to be impacted by this? You know, we're talking about outlooks, it's numbers, it's figures, but what is life going to be like this year and next year for people?
Well, first of all, there are many countries in crisis already. Those tend to be smaller countries and lower income countries. Those are already in crisis, in debt distress. There's food shortages in some countries. So we do see crisis in certain parts of the world. Secondly, it could be spread more broadly that we see recessions and that we see crisis. And finally, even for countries in advanced economies, for example, where economic activity is slowing down, we could see more unemployment and we could see lower incomes going forward.
And recession is that looming word. Is it going to be a reality for the majority?
For the moment, our baseline is one where only 1/3 of countries is going to be hit by recession, but even that is a relatively high number. But of course, there's the risk that the global economy is going to be in recession. And even if that's not occurring, it might feel like a recession. So it might feel like the economy is slowing down.
So it sounds like people need to brace themselves.
Absolutely. So what we are talking about at the moment is a warning shot for the global economy, for global financial stability, and for the everyday lives of people.
Do you have any silver linings for us? Is there anything you specifically feel hopeful about?
Banks are better capitalized. So after the global financial crisis, there was a big effort to capitalize banks, and we looked very closely at the global banks. They do have more capital, they do have more liquidity, so they should be relatively more resilient in terms of surviving in an adverse environment. Having said that, once we look into emerging markets, there's quite a bit of vulnerability. So what we find is that up to 30% of total bank assets could be undercapitalized in a severely adverse scenario.
Okay, so it's a rocky ride ahead. Tobias,
Absolutely.
Adrian, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So the downgrade announcement was closely watched around the world, and reaction is still coming in. Christine Lagarde is the head of the European Central Bank and here with me now. What was your reaction? Better, worse than you expected?
Well, first of all, lovely to be here, lovely to see you. And I'd like to first of all start with the IMF is still the IMF.
Right.
So it's fantastic to see people coming together, exchanging views and ideas, not all being on the same page, but prepared to confront their respective views.
And in person
and of
this
course,
time.
And in person, which is, really great. Now, of course, the WEO is always the most expected moment, as is then later on the GFSR and the fiscal monitor and the flagship reports in general. I think everybody expected the downgrade, so it didn't come much as a surprise. And I think that all forecasters around the world have been downgrading projections recently, so it's not a surprise that the IMF downgraded theirs.
And the outlook isn't particularly optimistic. Are you surprised by the kind of headlines that have come out in terms of how gloomy they have been? What are we in store for here?
Well, when you look around, there is not a lot to make you, cheerful and ecstatic about the economic developments or the geopolitical events. So I think it's hardly surprising that the outlook is indeed quite gloomy, and that we have to all look at what needs to be done, how serious we have to be about delivering on our missions in view of what's happening.
And when you have such a complex picture that involves a pandemic, that involves a war, how optimistic can we be that the IMF this week can come up with something vaguely optimistic? Do you think it can?
In times of real trouble, as we are going through now, it's critically important that everybody takes their responsibility seriously, that everybody does their job. But it's critically important that there is cooperation, that there is good coordination between those who have to coordinate. Whether you talk about monetary policy and monetary policy from one country to the other, from one group of countries to another group, whether you talk about monetary policy and fiscal policy, whether you talk about the energy policy mix that needs to be revisited. All these things have to be debated, and there is no better place in the world at the moment than the IMF and the World Bank to actually debate those matters.
Now, back in April, you said that Ukraine was a watershed moment for Europe. Did you ever imagine that we'd be where we are now in October with things almost as bad as they were at the very beginning?
You know, I think the big difference between April and now is that Ukraine is gaining ground that it had lost in those days, and that it is showing a spirit of resilience and determination which probably was not expected back in April. We all hoped that it would be the case, but clearly it is being demonstrated on the ground.
And if we're looking at a long-term war, which at the moment it appears that we are, there surely needs to be a long-term financial plan, economic plan. How is that going to take shape? Are we looking at having to put up with these rise in food prices, fertilizer? Is that something people have to get used to? Is it possible to get used to that?
Well, from my own perspective, as president of the European Central Bank, what we need to do is to return inflation to where it should be in the medium term, that is 2%. We are at a very high level, undesirably high at the moment, and we need to do the job that we have to do, which is to return to the 2% medium-term inflation that, for us, is price stability. Now, obviously, lots of other things have to be done by lots of other people, and I'm sure that the IMF will be the good forum to discuss what is needed for Ukraine in terms of financial support, in terms of reconstruction when the war is over, and so on and so forth. People I know are working hard on those numbers and on the rescue packages that need to be put in place.
We've heard analogies of accelerators and brakes when it comes to interest rates and inflation. How can we fine-tune this on a sort of consensus level? Is it possible?
Of course it is possible to work on consensus. It doesn't mean that there is unanimity. It means that people are prepared to move in the right direction, which is determined by the mission that they have. In the case of the European Central Bank, it's fairly straightforward. We have to deliver price stability. We have defined price stability as 2% in the medium term, and we have to use the tools that we have available, which will be the most efficient to deliver that.
So we're looking at a tough year, rest of the year, and possibly an even tougher year next year. It sounds like people need to brace themselves. What would you say to people heading into all this?
I would say that nobody can go alone and count on its own resources only. So we are in a situation where everybody needs to help everybody else, be mindful of everybody else, and also accept that we don't know it all. We know that this winter is going to be tough. What we know about next year, yeah, everybody likes to make prediction, to have projections for a year from now. I think we have to be a little bit humble and be prepared to constantly review the situation, revisit our projections, and take the determined action that is needed.
And just finally, how does it feel for you to see all of this again? Obviously, 2 years with everybody behind computer screens, not the same atmosphere at all, and here we are back in person. Does that make a difference?
It's lovely to be back. For me, I've heard so many times, welcome home,
right,
that it really feels like coming home, yes.
And does that sense of energy that it creates, does that allow some kind of catalyst, or does it make reaching those agreements and solutions more possible when you are face to face?
I think it's much easier because, number one, you read the body language. Number two, the sense of accountability to each other is probably increased by the physical proximity, yes.
Okay, Christine Lagarde, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very much. Now, today's outlook matters whether you're in Washington or Kathmandu. Today's figure is making headlines around the world. CNBC wrote, IMF cuts global growth forecast for next year, warns the worst is yet to come. Barron's noted IMF again lowers call on world GDP growth, citing sea of risks. And China Daily's headline was, inflation, higher rates stifle global growth, IMF says. Once the GFSR was released, the Wall Street Journal posted this: rapid rise in rates could fuel global economic disorder. Now, a big part of the economic puzzle is, of course, the private sector. Joining us for that perspective is Mike Froman. He's the Vice Chairman and President of Strategic Growth for MasterCard. So, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Slower growth, what's that going to mean for credit markets?
Well, I think everyone is adjusting to the reduced expectations of growth, the higher inflation, the food and energy crisis, and the spillover effects. What we're seeing, though, is even in the midst of this, relatively strong consumer spending, at least in the advanced industrialized countries. And there's a division with some of the consumers spending more money on issues like travel and others spending more money on the basics of food and energy and housing. But the consumer sentiment remains strong and their personal balance sheets are in relatively good shape. So I think in terms of credit, a lot of worries here in the hallways here about the rise of inflation, the strong dollar, the impact this could have on emerging markets, and the challenges that they could have in terms of rolling over and extending additional debt, the higher cost of capital. But meanwhile, on the positive side, the consumer remains strong.
And as interest rates are going up, you alluded to it a bit there, but what are you seeing on the ground when it comes to consumers and their behavior at the moment?
Well, they continue to have pretty strong confidence sentiment, and they're adjusting their own personal balance sheets. Some of them are still living off of maybe packages from COVID that helped increase their savings. Readjustment of work, of course, is happening, and everyone is adjusting to what the new reality is. But at least in the meantime, they are continuing to show confidence and continuing to spend.
So what action do you want to see from ministers, from central bank governors here this week at the annual meetings? What do you think needs to happen?
Well, as the managing director said, we're at a particularly fragile time in the global economy. And the last time we were at this stage, back in 2008, 2009, the G20 and this institution, all the members came together and really demonstrated strong collaboration. In the meantime, we've seen the international system pull apart a little bit, some de-integration of the international system, greater nationalism, greater focus on localization. And I think the challenge for this week and what the world will be looking for is how much collaboration will there be between ministers and central bank governors and governments in terms of dealing with this fragile global economy.
And there will be a lot of talk about CBDC, so that's central bank digital currency, during the annual meetings, and other alternatives for cheaper, faster digital payments. Can you give us an outline of what those are and what sort of purpose they serve?
Well, there's a lot of innovation going on in the payments field at the moment. We see it in our partnership with fintechs and with central banks all over the world. And digital currencies could well be an important part of that going forward. Of course, it's got to be strong consumer value. They've got to be stable. We can't live with the volatility of cryptocurrencies if they're going to play a meaningful role in the payment system. And they've got to be regulated in a fashion that is really buttoned up to make sure that they're not used for money laundering as well. I think one of the key things that we're seeing over the last year or so is that it's not just about having faster, cheaper payments. You also want to make sure those payments are safe and secure, that they're protected from cyber theft, that they're protected from fraud. Trust is absolutely key to the global payment system, and the digital currency world is still, I think, at the initial stages of developing what a trust framework may look like. But we're partnering with central banks all over the world and helping them with our expertise from the payment system, and look forward to working with them as they decide whether they want to go down that route.
It's all evolving. Mike Froman, thank you so much for joining us on IMF Today. Now, the meetings are packed with panels and policies, but this big important gathering is also about people and how to improve lives. Those discussions are taking place all over the building. Today, it was representatives of dozens of civil society organisations, that's non-profits and think tanks, coming together to try and come up with economic solutions for some of the most vulnerable people in the world. One of those groups is Oxfam International, and I asked Executive Director Gabriela Boucher why it's so important for her group to be here.
So we're here because it's very important to influence policymakers on this week on the important policies that are required to reduce inequality and poverty worldwide. The COVID pandemic has affected, as we all know, health, but also economies across the world. And now this is compounded by the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis. So we see a great rise, unfortunately, in poverty numbers and also acute hunger. So there's more than 200 million at the moment facing acute hunger. So we know that there are policies that can address these issues, and we're here to talk about that. And we have published with our partners, Development Finance International, a report called The Commitment to Reducing Inequality, and it ranks countries in terms of their policies that would reduce inequality and therefore also reduce poverty. And there are policies around social spending, so investment in health, education, social protection, on taxation, and also on workers' rights.
It does feel like a pivotal moment at the moment, doesn't it, in terms of things you mentioned like inflation, like the rise in food and fuel prices. What do you want to come out of this week with? What is the priority for you?
So there are extreme circumstances, and we must remember that there are people living it really acutely in terms of their lives. So it's not just the effect on health, but really many lives are at risk. And there are policy choices that can be made and should be made now urgently, and it's not business as usual. We're really in critical times, so we must focus on more spending on health, education, social protection, and certain countries have done it. For example, Nepal during these 2 years has doubled their investment on health, but there is an exception. The majority of countries have been reducing their spend in health at such critical times, education, social protection, all absolutely necessary investments in people's lives. And there are resources available which are not being tapped into. So there is an explosion in wealth. We have seen how much billionaire wealth has grown during the pandemic. There, for example, in the food sector, 62 new billionaires were created during the pandemic at a time when hunger is at unprecedented levels. So there is opportunity for windfall taxes, for example, to raise more funds and be able to invest in these things. There's obviously debt payment cancellation. Debt has grown enormously because of the rates changes and because, of course, the appreciation of the dollar. So it's at unsustainable levels for many countries, and that means effects on people's lives that we should actually really urgently address. And there are many more measures. There is a whole toolbox of possibilities of what governments can do. They're common sense, and they need to be applied now with urgency.
You mentioned it's, these meetings very much about policy, panels, but also people.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that message is heard?
Yes, the thing is, when we talk about public policies, it can sound very abstract. But in the end, it is about someone's life at the end of the story. So austerity, for example, affects, it sounds abstract, but it means someone can't access health or education, or a family falls into extreme poverty.
Gabriela, thank you.
Thank you very much.
One of today's seminars examined debt restructuring and whether the actions being taken may be too little, too late. That panel was moderated by Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, and he joins me now. Thanks for joining us, Martin. So what were your highlights from the panel?
Well, probably the following things. First of all, there are a very large number of countries, predominantly low-income countries, that are in debt distress or close to it. And given what is now going on in the world economy, if you look at the external environment, the strength of the dollar, much of the external debt is in dollars, the rising interest rates as well, and the weakening world economy, very well described in the World Economic Outlook, that's likely to get worse. So very significant problem. The second thing that I took away is that the debt picture is very complicated. The structure of debt, if you like, in terms of who the debtors are, both governments and the private sector and the parastatal sector, and the creditors, the official creditors, the private sector, and the official creditors obviously include China, and also the major Western nations. So it's a very complicated structure. The third problem is we're not very transparent about this, in the sense we don't really know in detail the structure of the debt, the nature of the claims, the collateral and so forth, which is really difficult. And finally, it's very difficult to deal with this because the too little, too late problem actually applies to every individual restructuring, as well as the problems in dealing with a large number of countries together. And there are reasons why too little, too late happens, which is that the debtor countries don't want to admit they can't pay because that's critical, and the creditors don't really want to give too much because they're gambling for resurrection. They hope that the debt will come good, particularly if they don't give much, perhaps somebody else will. So I learned 5 really pretty big things.
So it's a massively complex situation in a very difficult, challenging landscape. Were any solutions that you had faith and hope in offered up today?
I think to me, the most interesting proposition was and the one I think that everybody agreed on, was that there needed to be vastly more transparency of what the actual debt situation is, that we are, as it were, flying or traveling blind. And that means that when any crisis emerges, often the first thing you have to do is work out who owns what to whom, on what terms, who's got special claims for particular items which are collateral in the debt process. If you don't have transparency, it's obviously very, very difficult to get anything done, and that's really is the first requirement. Then you get into the really big difficulty of whether you can actually organize the debt restructuring process, and there has been some progress over time, collective action clauses and so forth, but it remains a very complicated process, and there are a lot of very different creditors now with very different expectations and aspirations. So it would be nice if that was simpler, but you can't force it to be simpler. It just is as complicated as it is.
And those solutions you mentioned, are we going to see them in action anytime soon?
Well, some things like the way collective action clauses, or even cross collective action clauses that operate across various issuances, in a major restructuring, they will clearly be involved. But the big lesson I took away from this is that if we do, please God, no, but if we do get into really large number of serious debt problems, they're going to be really quite difficult to resolve. And if you look at what's going on in Sri Lanka, just take one example now, or Argentina, yeah, life can get very, very difficult if this happens to a lot of countries simultaneously. And it happens to big countries, which most people think won't happen. It could be a big mess.
Big challenges ahead on all fronts, I think, is what we're taking away from today. Martin Wolf, thank you very much for joining us.
A pleasure.
Now, tomorrow gets even busier here at IMF headquarters in DC. We're kicking off with the Fiscal Monitor at 8:30. We also have the first in our series of capacity development talks and the first of the governor talks, this one with the Netherlands and Colombia. The next two seminars tackle policies for people, that's making inclusive choices under tight budgets, and getting to net zero with international financial institutions and multilateral partnerships. Then the day concludes with a cultural event celebrating Kenya. Thank you for joining us on IMF Today. We'll leave you with some of the best images of the day from around IMF headquarters. Let's do it again tomorrow.